of survival. And of course, what's happening in hindsight is that, I mean, this is the Serge Dane reference becomes very interesting here, because there was an aesthetic that literally seemed to emerge from that everydayness. It is not as though you sat down and said, now how will I make this film? You know, I mean, we do, even now, I mean, we have documentary filmmakers here who will tell you about how you shoot for the moment and then you sit back and take a deep breath and say, how will I edit this? Which is a very standard narrative. Here it does not seem as though he edited in a way that was different from the spirit of the actual shooting. He seemed to have just made it all within that particular sort of structure, as it were. And I think it was part of that time, you know. I mean, I can go in autobiographical mode here, but it's not really. I mean, we should talk about that situation.
I mean, I mean, just getting the sense of the time that leads to so many contradictions within the film. Maybe I'll start with the character of Ranjit Mallick himself. Who's at first a very charming guy, a little corrupt because he's trying to get a job through recommendation. So, but we still identify with him as a charming guy. But on the bus, that identification is broken, and then we are supposed to look at him as a subject. But then the film just forgets that and wants us to again identify with him. And then at the point of the fulfillment of his desire, the interview itself is skipped. And then again, he just disembowels him in the final scene. So our relationship with Ranjit Mallick, it keeps shifting throughout the film. So how do you see this character? I mean, do you see a kind of a consistency which is beyond psychological consistency? What do you think drives this character through this film?
I mean, who knows? I'll tell you the problem. The difficulty that has arisen now is that Mrinal Sen is a filmmaker whom we thought we knew. You know, there was something settled about Mrinal Sen. You know that, especially I think, you know, because frankly, I feel that after color comes in and after he settles into a more classical storyline sort of format, he does himself a little bit of injustice. Although you get some elements of this in Akale Sondane, let us say, or Kharij, let us say. In Chalchitra, which is a film that he made much later, it actually has the same reference to the suit. Right. If you remember, what happens there is that the hero is, Anjan Dutt is actually standing on the street and it's very late at night and he's missed the last bus, and some man who's wearing a full suit comes and says to him, "Come to my house." And then he says, "Who are you?" And you must be some rich guy. And he turns out, like the Aesop's fable, that he takes off his suit, and then he's of course just anybody else. So there are certain references that continue, but having said that, it does seem that you thought you knew the 70s films. There was something that you thought you understood. And now that they are coming out in this newly restored form, you actually realize that there's something going on which you hadn't worked out, in a way. For me, two things happen. One is that it's very difficult for me to look at particularly these four films. I mean, Chorus, this one, Padatik and Bhuvan Shom, as separate films, because there are things that continuously refer to each other. Yeah. And staying with this young protagonist, you'll remember at the end of Calcutta 71, the idea of that young protagonist is a young man who is 1,000 years old. He's like a young man who was actually born in the beginning of civilization, and he continues. Now, it's a bit of I don't know whether he's able to pull it off, but then there's very little about Mrinal Sen that bothers with things like that. He just has an idea and he does it. So he does have an idea of who this protagonist is. Yeah. He is a radical figure, he is a political figure, he is a protest figure, he is a student, he's also an aspiring proto-bourgeois sort of person with a certain idea of self-interest. He's also a lover boy. He, depending on what you want him to do. And then, of course, at the end of this film, you have this whole confrontation with the spectator around this. So he's a very unsettled kind of entity, which is...
because it also works against the principles of what cinematic realism is, right? I mean... Typically, we are presented with a protagonist, we identify with their desire, and then we want that desire to be fulfilled. But this film is kind of pulling the rug constantly. So it's almost like, in some ways, this film plays like a parody of something like Bicycle Thieves, right? I mean, where, if you've not seen, the protagonist is a working class man who needs a cycle for his job. and then the cycle is lost, and he's going around Rome to get this, whatever, find a cycle, and then finally he steals another cycle. So Interview almost plays like a parody of that. And there is a constant dialogue within this film with this idea of neorealism, especially with the Ray variety. I mean, Pather Panchali, when that excerpt from Pather Panchali is inserted into the fabric of this film, that stands out so dramatically. It almost feels like a melodrama. So the relationship of Sen to neorealism, how do you conceive that? I mean, do you see him as a realist at all?
I mean, that's the other thing, right? I mean, what I've been very interested in is films that engage with realism but are not themselves realist. I think this is a very much of an art trope as well, I mean, if you look at neo-realism in the classic neo-realist sense, of course, you also have different schools of that. Yeah. Very few Indian films are neo-realists, I mean, it's like, I mean, one of the things that one had said a long time ago was that realism is the theory, melodrama, the practice. Yeah. So that actually these realist films, end up with this like, and Pather Panchali, I mean, all my argument essentially with Bengali friends has always been that Pather Panchali is at base a melodrama. Yeah. And it's a problem that I've had with filmmaker friends who just don't seem to accept what I think is a relatively obvious fact, that it ends with the tragic kind of idiom and so on. So there is a way in which these films engage with realism, but they are not realists themselves, and I think there is a politics to that engagement. The point is that we have had in India, sort of from I think the late 50s onwards, but well into the 60s, and of course with the National Film Development Corporation and Indira Gandhi's period, when she was the INB minister, a certain kind of state realism, a certain way in which you had a government-sponsored realism that would at once cater to the European art house and cater to what was eventually the 20-point economic program, actually work with nationalist ideologies of developmentalism while adhering to the kind of aesthetic canons. Yeah. So it was in some ways the kind of wet dream of the Indian state, and it becomes a really big political problem during the emergence, some years after this film was made, when Satyajit Ray then becomes the poster boy of Indira Gandhi's emergency. Even though he's ideologically opposed to the emergency, he formally sort of lends that narrative, that style of a certain kind of realism to the state, who will do that. So films that then work against, chafe against and fight that realism, then becomes part of a political problem. I mean, for example, the Shyam Benegal, being a much more, shall we say, politically compromised figure, being what was then known as the middle-of-the-road cinema, which is actually seen as statist, defines this politics, as it were. And I think that, so realism actually becomes a big political issue at that time as well, is the point I was making.
So, state-sponsored realism, one thing is like catering to the art canons of the West. Why do you think it was important for the state to cultivate a realist cinema? Is it like a citizen building project? Why would
this is a very big problem. The problem that we have, and this is a canonical argument, that in every single country on this planet that was a colonized country that become independent, the need to create a national cinema was always a priority. India is unique in this entire history of decolonization in that we have a major film industry that precedes independence, and it is a film industry that the independent Indian nation state of the Nehruvian period has no patience with. They are not interested in the Hindi commercial cinema or any other commercial cinema. They think that the need for reforming the film industry to make a certain kind of cinema in the Nehruvian mold becomes very important. Marie Seaton, the film theorist who's written about Ray, becomes very important because before Pather Panchali, she is actually casting around for what kind of cinema the Indian state could adopt. So Bimal Roy is a contender, Mehboob Khan is a contender, K. Abbas is a contender, and then along comes Pather Panchali and say, finally, we now have a cinema that we can be truly proud of. And the entire effort then is to try and get the rest of Indian cinema to start making films like that. to start making films that are then funded by the government and are to reform the film industry financially and to create an aesthetic revolution. So this is then what that then sets out to do, and it becomes a problem in the emergency.
Yeah.
And it remains a problem well into the early 80s, which is when the Indian state drops the cinema and moves to television, as its main propaganda arm, so to say. So, I mean, but in this time, I think that the crisis of aesthetics as a specific contributor to the politically charged moment of the time is on this fault line. That's where the problems actually emerge.
And how do you see that tension play out in the long debates between Satyajit Ray and Mrinal Sen over specific films? I mean, there have been like a lot of printed rivalry between these two figures. So do you think that it translates to the same thing, because Satyajit Ray calling Mrinal Sen's Bhuvanchom a gimmicky film, or what was a modish film? And do you think that actually hinges on the question, their different approaches to realism?
It does. I mean, I just want to give everybody a little, I don't know if you're all familiar with this particular thing, but this major, Ray, interestingly, was a polemicist. I mean, he attacks Alain René, he attacks Pasolini, and he says that, he says that a film like, I forgotten which Alain René film. He says that in a poor third world country like mine, I am not able to make these kinds of films. These are sort of modish, sort of, that in a way, if you're a third world filmmaker, then you have to make films that are constrained by that particular limitation. And he fundamentally believed that if you script your film, that if you told a story in a straightforward way, if you made a film which actually saved budgets, then you could make good films within these constraints. And he considered this kind of cinema to be basically self-indulgent. So quick little aside, what happens is that actually Mrinal Sen makes a film called Akash Kusum before all this. And it is not as radical a film as these. But nevertheless, that is the film that sets Ray off. And they have a furious, very interesting debate in the pages of The Statesman. When letters, they each write letters to the editor basically attacking each other. And he describes these kinds of films as crow films. That's his phrase, a crow film. And what is a crow film? He says it refers to the fable of a crow who wore a peacock's plumage and said, "How beautiful I am." And he described a lot of these modish shots, as like the plumage on the crow. And he said that telling a story in a straightforward way saves money. And it is a responsible way of making films. And this kind of cinema, which is all jump cut and all that stuff, is basically self-indulgent. So this was a fight that they had through the late 60s and into the early 70s, long before with Akash Kusum. And then, of course, then what happened was that Ray wrote two long essays. One was called An Indian New Wave ? Where he attacks Bhuvanchom, and he says that in Hollywood, you had to tell the story of a plot in 7 words. That was necessary, right? And he says this was big, bad bureaucrat reformed by rustic belle. And that's the story. So why, if you have a story like that, can you not tell the story in a fairly simple manner? It's essentially a simple story that he's telling. So why all this cut, all these jump cuts and all this stuff, this moving around. That particular essay was written in 74. The emergency was declared in 75. And soon after that, you had in the National Film Development Corporation, which was actually getting to have a problem because a number of the really important experiments that were being done by Indian filmmakers, including Kumar Shahani and others, were being done through loans that the Film Finance Corporation was giving, and those loans were not coming back. And they said that we are going to go after these filmmakers and we are going to recover our money. We could put them in jail. They had to give collateral, which was often, somebody's house or something. That we're going to seize their house. We're going to do this stuff. And then there was a Government of India committee report, which actually referred to an aesthetic practice on how Indian cinema should be, which was largely modeled on what Ray was saying. That these were films that have Indianness in theme and approach, characters with whom an audience can identify, human interest in the story. So it became a certain sort of an aesthetic style that in a way Ray, arguably unintentionally perhaps, made available, for in a way the state. So he was close to Mrs. Gandhi, although he was opposed to the emergency. So, but there was a certain kind of problem that had arisen. And I mean, while Sen was too senior a filmmaker, although he was very, very extensively attacked, Kumar Shahani, he dismisses Maya Darpan in a paragraph in an essay called 4 1/4. And he attacks Manikol's Duvidha, basically arguing for why Ankur and Garam Hawa are the films that India should really be making. And these films are completely self-indulgent, and Kumar Shahani couldn't make a film for the next decade. He actually, in a way, it was an astonishing situation for a senior filmmaker to attack a first-time director in the way that he did, aware of the kind of clout he had, So, I think that this is part of the aesthetics of the political moment that we had at that time between them.
Yeah, and it's an extremely unfair criticism as well to say that, these are flourishes and this is what is essential. It's all finely stylizations and form, right? That's why this insertion of Pather Panchali here, it shows up that Ray is also a stylist. It's not like he's doing it in some, he's true to some pure essence of the cinema and the rest is just flourishes. It's like, it's one way of stylization which has the state backup and the rest probably don't. And it comes back to bite Ray when Nargis in the early 80s or maybe late 70s, she talks in the parliament about how Ray is commodifying poverty for the West and so on. So finally, there's no pleasing the state in some way, right? It's just, there's always going to be this post-colonial angst. That's what, that brings me to the end of this film. In some ways it's a futile protest, right? Breaking the mannequin, destroying the mannequin that's wearing a suit because it represents the West. It's like renaming Port Blair or whatever. So it is a symbolic protest, but it's also very futile. And I want to ask about this question of this dhoti versus this thing, especially with respect to what Ambedkar and his sartorial choices mean. The suit is not always West, and it has different meanings even in the local context. But to pose this dhoti as this, this Indian identity or pre-colonial identity versus the suit, I think the film is conflicted over that. But do you think it's too fine a point that is made at the end?
Could be. I'm sure there are friends who are Bengali who may know better. But in a way, I think that there is a Bhadralok ideology, which seems to straddle exactly that kind of divide. I think it was Partha Chatterjee, who makes the argument that nationalism happened in the domestic space. You actually went out to work. You had a public persona, and that public persona was Western, but you were completely Indian at home, as it were. And this idea of the home and the world, to quote Tagore, does, I think, open up that particular crisis of what constitutes the public face of the domestic, in a sense. I think this is part of that history of nationalism. Yeah. So, some of the kinds of references to the Bhadralok figures, the Kalighat kind of images that you have suddenly cut out there. In a way, it's a caricature because, he then eats pan, he's wearing what they call this Punjabi, and he tucks this thing into his pocket, which is how they dress. There is a certain kind of slightly caricatural idea of the Bhadralok gentleman wearing that dhoti Punjabi, which I think he's also making reference to, but it certainly opens up the home and the world argument there.
Yeah. Even the thief is, of course, in a dhoti, and the people who are catching him are all in shirt and pants. The question of, my question was whether this sort of a post-colonial critique often can feed into very right-wing nationalist narratives, right? So that's so today watching somebody assert the dhoti as like this symbol of indigenous symbol for me has a double edge. And also this question of technology I want to bring up because almost out of nowhere, not really. The final interview that's shot in the IBM offices, and then he says the computer is the enemy or it's taking away jobs, and so but at the same time, Mrinal Sen is shooting with these lightweight equipments that's enabling him to shoot on the street and so on. So how do you kind of see Mrinal Sen's relationship with technology? Because both Ray and Ghatak, they have their own position papers in Ajantrik and Abhijaan. So Mrinal Sen and technology, because that's a recurring theme even in the later films in Chorus and Padatik. So
I was actually quite surprised by this. I didn't remember this, this whole thing about the computer and, all those other IBM machines and so on. I didn't actually remember this. I remembered it rather differently, so I'll have to think about this. Again, a very specific kind of a Bengali history around what they call chakri, which is basically work, the work in alienated conditions. So the idea of modernity as a condition of alienation, that you go to work, you go to office. I've been there in Megadakatara, for example, that she goes to work, that work as a form of alienated labor does have a certain history. It's also there in Ray. I mean, so Seema Badha, which is the other film that we're going to see, is about a corporate kind of office kind of situation as well. But along with that does come things like, for example, the telephone, the sort of entire kind of, shall we say, the typewriter, the apparatus of modernity associated with that alienation.
Yeah. Because when you mention work, throughout the film, Ranjit is surrounded by different forms of labor. I mean, even to get up, get ready, it requires the labor of two women in the house. And then everywhere he violently intercuts Ranjit's getting ready for the interview with, the fish market, the barber, and so on. So there is this Ranjit's journey through the day is inscribed in the labor of so many other people. So, so and then finally he's kind of, his own revolutionary conscience is embedded in a very sore personal disappointment. So this question of work, technology, labor, everything is like, it's built up to this final moment, even though for me also the whole computer thing feels so superfluous or at least sudden in some ways.
It's a bit early for computers, actually.
And also this, one of the most masterful things is the way he handles time. Again, this question of realism and work. For example, the way he dilates time or shrinks it, we know that the interview is at, 2:30 or something, but then he has no time to sit in a barber shop because he has to get ready, but at the same time he has time to go meet his sweetheart and dream about everything. And then again, for example, when he's ringing the doorbell, there is this extreme dilation of time, or when he's looking at the yellow pages and so on. So Mrinal Sen is playing with this idea of neorealist or realist time, but at the same time, he's shifting from here and there. He's on the tram, then he's back at home. So he's playing it like an accordion, this idea of cinematic time. So time, space.
I just wanted to come in on this time thing. Actually, I had some images to show you. Can you? So I have a story to tell actually about this time thing, which is interesting. I'd mentioned the fact that he did a lot of shooting, right? That he did a huge amount of documentary footage. How do I play this? Okay. Just very quickly, this was that alienation sequence, that you get when he says, "I'm Ranjit Mallick," and so on. And this is the camera. You saw this. You also get, this is in Chorus, this is K.K. Mahajan shooting, and you get a sense of the kind of conditions under which they shot. But I wanted to talk about a particular phenomenon that concerns time. So what happened was that from 1969, Mrinal Sen started shooting in the streets, right? These are all images from many films, but I think primarily from Calcutta 71. And he didn't keep any great record of what he shot when. And what then happened was something really interesting. In 1971, September, when Calcutta 71 was released at Metro Theatre, students had come there and they surrounded Sen and they said, "When did you take this shot?" And he said, "Well, he said, no, please tell me when did you take the shot, because I can see my friend in the shot who is now missing." the friend is now presumably missing and dead, and he was there in your shot. So please tell me, when did you take that shot? And he said, well, I don't know, 69, 70, 71, and so on. Something now strange happened, which is that every time Calcutta 71 was being shown, students would gather who were least interested in his theories of what he was showing, but they were just wanting to look and find images of people on screen whom they knew. So suddenly the films became significant in a certain way. It was like the audiences were seeing themselves on screen, and these people were looking like they might step out and be audiences, okay? Something else happened in Calcutta, which was very interesting. Badal Sarkar is performing Sagina Mahato, okay, in the round. Huh? So this is something called the All Bengal Teachers Association in Calcutta. Again, friends from Calcutta may know this place. It's a large, one of those cavernous rooms. It's just a big hall. And the hall had tube lights on top. And Badal Sarkar had put stage lights around a certain space, yeah, dividing audiences from the stage performance. What happened was that in the middle of the play, the lights went out because this was power cut. Load shedding, the lights completely went. The lights on the stage went, the lights in the auditorium went. The actors continued performing, okay? The actors continued performing, and the play went on in pitch darkness. After a minute, the house lights, that is, the lights on top came on, and after another minute, the stage lights came on. And he said what was astonishing was that at the end of the performance, nobody mentioned this fact, And this led him to do two things. One is, it led him to more or less eliminate this artificial divide between spectators and performers, which was the stage space. So he started performing on streets, he started performing in parks, and he started increasingly eliminating the distinction between spectator and performer, which meant that he was doing something that was similar to what was happening with Mrinal Sen. The distinction between spectator and performer that was there. The students who were in the auditorium and the students who are on the screen became one, in that sense, right? Now, I think time has something to do with this, and I think that the kind of temporal structure that arises from what I would want to think of as a certain kind of expanded cinema, or a certain aesthetic practice, I think it relates to, I want to show you something here around. So these are images. This is from Badal Sarkar's play. This is Vivan Sundaram's photography work that he had done. And this is Somnath Hore's work called Wounds, in which he actually has this, he gouges out images up there. All these are works that happen at the same time, they're at the historically the same juncture. And all of them constitute a certain kind of spatio-temporal violation, of the ideas of narrative continuity, right? Which is what I wanted. I was very interested in that particular kind of structure that he had. It's one thing for him to say, I wasn't aware of when I took the shot. That he may have taken these shots just like that. He won't know who this guy was or anything like that. But nevertheless, when you start associating that with the confrontation that he has in the end of interview with his spectator, who says, weren't you implicated by what now happened, right? I'm saying that there was a certain kind of an aesthetic practice that he was obviously trying, which was associated with that particular sort of, shall we say, challenge, in the way that spatio-temporal disturbances, around the realist pact, between spectator and performer, get disturbed.
Maybe on that note, it's time for the spectators to become performers. We'll have a roving mic, is that, or, okay, great. Perfect. So, questions, comments, anything on the film? Around the film?
I think there's someone there.
At this time that this film was made, you have a lot of filmmakers who engage in socialist rhetoric, and you had a government which engaged in socialist rhetoric. And they had an uneasy relationship because you have filmmakers funded by the government who do, endorse the labor movement, which was in conflict with the government. And despite, how authoritarian governments could be in those days, there was still this space for the government to fund filmmakers, who produce art which is in some way critical of state policy, whether directly or indirectly or kind of obliquely. Do you think that the kind of drying up of funds for filmmakers from the state has deprived them of, the freedom to produce work like that? And whatever, there's lots of criticism that you could direct at those filmmakers. Yeah. Could you comment on how that has affected the film that is being produced now?
I mean, that's a great question, and I have to confess that I don't have an answer, not least because it continues to be a controversial question. There's something very strange that happened in India, which is that all of these filmmakers, whether it is Ray, whether it is Bengal, whether it is Mrinal Sen, whether it is Sathyu, none of them face censorship issues, Now, this is not unusual. I mean, Thatcherite England actually was an occasion when a lot of independent cinema happened with state support. Peron's Argentina was another occasion. So totalitarian conditions producing independent cinema is something we have known in different parts of the world and in India. And it was very interesting was that politically, in the way, see what happens in the politics of the emergency at least, is that the opposition is to state censorship. These filmmakers aren't censored. Politically, all of them, without exception. Yeah, you have something to say?
Sorry, just a follow-up. Could you argue that it's because they didn't go far enough?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I have a feeling that, censorship, that's another story. I think censorship and how censorship works, or has worked in a place like India, is in itself quite a story. It doesn't sort of work. Okay, let me put it this way. I think censorship as an aesthetic practice and the actual functioning of the censor board as a specific sort of entity are two different things. So we really have to ask a much more complicated question as to why films were censored when they were, and why films were let go when they were. I don't think it was an absence of radical intent, as it were. But what did happen then was that a very different argument, as I'm saying, around things like realism, the kind of Ray-Sen divide, for example, between filmmakers who were arguing about what seemed to be rather arcane issues that weren't captured by that political moment emerged. And those had something to do with funding. For example, the Film Finance Corporation's funding strategy was clearly defined by a political framework within which it was meant to work. And there was a Committee on Public Undertakings document on the functioning of the Film Finance Corporation that does go into this at some length. This was actually during the emergency. There would be, Mrinal Sen is interesting because, he will proudly tell you that not one single film of mine was a commercial success. He will equally proudly tell you that no two producers have ever made a film with me. So every time he made a film, he'd find a new producer. And yet he will tell you that I've never had difficulties in making films. I've been able to make films. It is actually a particularly aggravating stand that he took for a lot of younger filmmakers who genuinely had difficulties making films at that time. And what then the attitude of the state was or should have been towards this kind of cinema was actually very conflicted. Because unlike independent filmmakers from, let us say, the late 90s, who could make films outside of the state entirely, and filmmakers even from earlier who could make films outside the state entirely, this lot of independent filmmakers had no choice of making films except from money that they got from the state. So how then to square the fact that they were receiving state funding with their own political position was an issue. It was a real issue that defined the cinema of this time, and it is an issue on which very few filmmakers from that time actually have a coherent position. It is a very fraught problem. And I mean, there was something called the Forum for Better Cinema that had arisen. And I remember actually being present when fights broke out, I mean, between, I think it was Satyu, for example, and Suresh Jindal, and Suresh Jindal said, I am the only person in this whole room who's actually brought money into the cinema. None of you people, you can't do it. I mean, you are relying on the state. I did this. And then, I mean, so it was like, it was a very, very difficult time for the cinema. It's not an answer that I can necessarily give, because I think there isn't an answer as such. It's more an effort to chronicle a certain difficult moment in Indian cinema, and try and see the connections between those difficulties and the kind of films that we're now able to see that came out at that time.
Hi, good evening, sir. So I don't know if my question's a little pedestrian, but I did find the movie a little enigmatic in certain situations, especially because, they were building so much tension up for the actual interview. But when, they show the actual interview, they switch to visuals of all these people typing away in the typewriters. Is there a reason behind doing that? Because I'm not sure I understood that part very well.
I don't know, I mean,
Yeah, again, there is definitely a conscious effort to frustrate the viewer's expectation. That is there. He does that in different ways, and for him, it is. I mean, it's a thing of manifesto or whatever, of principle. He does that in many ways. I mean, that's the relationship with time and desire, right? It's just, I mean, even that calling bell scene, he keeps pressing the bell, but we know the time is running out. Or when he loses that suit on the bus, and then he comes to this telephone booth and he tries to look through the numbers. It's an impossibility because the time is running out. So there is definitely, he knows that the viewer is expecting something, and he takes maybe sadistic a pleasure in kind of interrupting that. And for him, it's not important that the question is not whether Ranjit gets the job or not, right? He kind of opens it up to other questions. It's like, and then that's the penultimate scene where he says, why am I not getting the job? If I had a suit, I would have gotten the job. If I had money, I would have gotten the suit. And then suddenly, like, this bourgeois guy becomes a revolutionary, saying, why are we living in this system where we cannot? So, yeah, there is definitely a question of opening up conventional expectations. So that is there. Whether it's successful or not, I think it varies according to the viewer.
Thank you for the talk. Listening to you talk, I remember like Walter Benjamin's mechanical reproduction of art comes to mind. And you being a film historian, I wanted to ask you a question that Benjamin basically talks about, how mechanical reproduction of art that is already produced is a good thing. There's a widespread phenomena where we think that that's not a good thing because it's like, decreasing the authenticity of the art. So if you can see Mona Lisa on your phone, it's decreasing what the authentic Mona Lisa Adler stands for. And we see that phenomena in films as well, right? Scorsese and a lot of other directors try to preserve films, and the digitality is making films more available to the normal consumer of film on their phones, and almost everyone has a smartphone. The revolutionary aspect of it and the accessibility of art that is increasing through this process is obviously something that needs to be welcomed, right? Considering how we are advancing towards a authoritative capitalist state, and some would argue that we already are. I want to know where you stand on this, especially considering that you are also your project that you were talking about at the beginning of the session. So where do you stand regarding this and preserving old cinema so that it becomes more and more accessible to not the only elite or if we use the normal language, the pretentious cinephile, but also someone outside the film studies course or discourse can watch these films and be exposed to this sort of films. So where do you stand?
difficult question, and I don't think I can answer it. I mean, maybe you and I should actually meet up and talk about it at some point. But just to give you a very quick, I'm sorry, it's not going to be an adequate answer. It's a complicated question, and I won't be able to give an adequate answer. Just as a prefatory thing, when I come to the answer, as I was saying, there are these orphaned films, And one of the conversations that I was having with Vinayak was that it was really weird. I said to him, let's do Albert Pinto ki Gussa Kyun Aata Hai, and we said, where do you get it from? NFDC. It's an NFDC film. Of course, it's an NFDC film. So we messaged NFDC, and they wrote back saying that we've never heard of the film. We don't know anything about it. Huh? Sorry? The NFDC says they have no idea about Albert Pinto. So Basav then phones Said Mirza, and Said says, yeah, well, I don't know whatever happened to it. The result is that, in all probability, the print that I have, which was given to me by someone's friends who's something, and all this kind of covert stuff that we have sitting around on our hard disks, might well be the only print there is, right? So I then started working with Vinayak. And I said to Vinayak that, I have a 2 DVD set of it, which is something that someone gave me many years ago. I think this might be the best available print of the film, so let's look at it. So we did, and we had to sort of stitch it together. He did it on his Final Cut Pro, and he converted the 2 DVD set into one single film, and then we tried to get some subtitling done and so on and so forth. Now, the NFAI has a print, and they are going to digitize it. But if, for any reason, they did not have a print, what I had in my hard disk of a famous film is all that there is. Yeah, there are many other examples. I mean, friends from Kerala will know a filmmaker called K.P. Kumaran. Do you know? Anyone knows K.P. Kumaran? A very famous film called Atithi. Now, Kumaran ought to have been where Adur Gopalakrishnan is. I mean, he was a very key figure in Swayamvaram. He co-wrote it and would have been a major figure. But he made Atithi, and that film was believed lost. Okay. The print that now exists is a print that some friend of his found in Dubai with Arabic subtitles. Okay, so that is now the print that exists, and that then becomes, if you like, the other side of the same story. So if on the one hand you get these 2K restorations that NFAI is doing, or even more, Film Heritage Foundation doing Ghatashraddha and showing it at the Venice Biennale, these other films that you're getting in whatever form that exists are the counterpart of that. They're the other half of that story, And I think these two halves tell a story together, okay? This is my prefatory point. Moving specifically to Benjamin, I think that the unfortunate, I'm no Benjamin scholar and I don't know German, but I think that the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction has been somewhat misunderstood, The idea of the aura that Benjamin talks about is a very complicated argument, and the aura, he suggests that industrial capital actually does away with aura. I think that he isn't saying that, but I need German friends to confirm what exactly he's saying, because it's a rather more complicated argument with associates with this idea of tragedy and so on. But the aura is something that has fully now returned. You see the aura, for example, on the one hand in the grainy pixels, and on the other hand, in these high-res versions. So what now has happened, and this would be my only concluding of an inadequate argument, is that if we had a crisis in film in the late 60s, early 70s, as I'm suggesting we had around this question of realism, and the kind of jump cuts and the sheer convolution, the convulsions that this film goes through is part of this complex political history that has documentary footage being inserted. I think we had a similar crisis again in the early 2000s, which will be very much more familiar to filmmakers now, in which, with the onset of digitization, you actually had a very, very difficult situation. Now, on the one hand, you had very low-res images, like sting videos, or the kind of images that you get on social media, which are incredibly, incredibly low res, in which you get these hazy the haziness is all you have, which capture one kind of aura, so that filmmakers are actually sometimes almost simulating that low res structure, to get a certain kind of affect. Right, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you're now getting films with really high-end documentaries, independent documentaries, with very high-end production values, including drone footage and, 4K project, this thing, and Atmos sound and all that. My suggestion is that both those kinds of films are two halves of the same story once again. That you can't tell the story of this side of documentary unless you actually also take in those grainy low-res images on the other end, because both of them actually come together to explain a certain kind of crisis, although they're doing it in two very, very different ways and mutually contradictory ways. So filmmakers who will want to rely on, you showed me Dhruv Solanki's film, films shot on the iPhone, for example, on the one hand, and this whole other kind of cinema in which you are, editing in your film in Finland and doing a post-production in Copenhagen, which is what is happening more and more with independent documentaries. You will actually have a divide, but that divide does evoke, I think for me, the earlier kinds of divides that also existed around this particular question precisely of aura. So I think that there's a way of writing that history of Benjamin's work in a much more complicated way than it has been usually comprehended. But as I say, it's an incomplete answer. We'll have to take it up as we go.
I had a question actually prefacing the previous question. So during the movie, we see a couple of shots where this narrative of the visual of the boat and all that comes, and then this alluding to still life. And then they show Ranjit Mallick's face a couple of times, and then there's this juxtaposition of time. So how do you think the filmmaker went about showing that? Like, what was the connection between still life, showing Ranjit Mallick at that time, the background? Was there some kind of connection?
Good question. I don't know.
I mean, it's a gag, first of all, because she's talking about still life, and the film treats him like a bit of an object, an idiot guy. So, and of course, there's a technological history to it, right? This optical printer coming into the picture, and 1970. I mean, he's actually using those still frames that are repeated for those sequences where he's still sitting as like an object. I don't know. It's a gag based on the idea that throughout the film there is an equivalence between people, their desire, and the media that surrounds them, right? There is this all these posters and ads and all these like socially constructed things that socially construct desire, all those things are surrounding him, and in a way he becomes the object of all those narratives. So there is a kind of objectification of the protagonist that happens. Even the fiancée, her own desires are so almost like cliches, right? It's just she wants a house and a pot and so on. So there is a kind of idiotization at work of the protagonist. Maybe this gag comes in line with that. I mean, still life, boat, apples, bananas, objects, and then this guy who's just sitting there wasting his time away even though he has an interview at 2:30.
Can you switch out the screen? It's radiating heat here. Thanks.
Hi. I just have one small question with regards to what I believe is a sort of metafictional component of the movie, right? When our protagonist is in the bus and he talks about how he is a character in the film itself, and how it relates to something like Close Up by Abbas Kiarostami, for example, where you have the protagonist who is actually in real life the same person. So my question is in regards to what is it about this metafictional component, and why do filmmakers tend to use this? Filmmakers such as Abbas Kiarostami or even Mrinal Sen, for example, in his movie In Search of Famine, he kind of uses again this metafictional component, right? So what do you think is the importance of it?
I don't know. Again, my personal thing is that someone like Kiarostami is doing it for far more complex reasons than why Mrinal Sen is doing it. Again, Akala Sandhane is, I think, a much more significant and more thought out thing than this particular film. I feel personally, again, I remember again in the early 70s, the independent experimental theatre was a very big thing. And they had just sort of discovered their Brecht and discovered this idea of alienation and discovered this idea of, talking to the audience or, characters coming out of the audience, all of those things. I mean, they were, I suppose, gimmicks, but there was something really interesting and fresh and I mean, it was really edgy to do that. I mean, for example, in Vijay Tedulkar, Hashiram Kotwal, all the Brahmins actually walk on the stage from the audience, right? I mean, it was the sort of thing that happened in those days. I don't personally think that this idea of him turning to the audience says, I'm actually Ranjit Mallick, and that, my mother is not really my mother, but she is the actress Karuna Bandyopadhyay, and she acted in this film called Pathet Panchali, and then they show a clip of Pathet Panchali. Actually was something that he had thought through beyond that, And K.K. Mahajan, who, there is a lot of footage, I realized, some footage of K.K. Mahajan on YouTube talking about Mrinal Sen, where he says that Sen would often improvise in very interesting and startling ways. What has happened, however, is that in hindsight, I mean, for reasons that you were talking about earlier, this has become significant. This has become significant in a way that I think, this whole thing about, filmic objects gathering significance over the years, so it actually becomes much more important now than it may have felt at the time when it was made. Is I think true in that particular sequence. I mean, apart from the fact that, of course, you see a very young K.K. Mahajan, and actually, when I saw this film, I think in Calcutta, I had Piyush Shah sitting next to me saying, just identify that camera. What was the camera? And he said it was an RE2C or something. I've forgotten. I think it was, he specifically mentioned it. I had actually thought that it may have been a 16mm camera, but he said no, it's 35mm. So there are other kinds of meanings that emerge, which may be part of that metafiction that you're talking about. I mean, but they're not part of the so-called intention of the filmmaker, which may or may not have been that much. There may not have been that much to it at that time.
And also, there is a desire to deconstruct all sorts of fiction, right? I mean, be they the fiction of capitalism and so on. But again, even in the house, the mother and the sister are always on the verge of laughing and breaking that fiction. It's like, the fiction is like this balloon that's really waiting to rupture. And the film is treading on that line where the fiction can always break. That's why that insertion of Satyajit Ray, Pathet Panchali, it's so outrageous because it breaks that fiction, but also shows up Satyajit Ray's fiction itself as like a construction, right? So, and again, 50 years hence, watching this film, the hierarchy between what is fiction and what is documentary changes, right? I mean, what strikes me are the faces that are sitting on the tram and pretending to be like whatever actors and so on. Today they have the force of documentary, but on the other hand, the protests and so on. He's used it so many times like an idiom. They become like this kind of literary device that is totally decontextualized. It's like a piece of fiction in itself. So the hierarchy between fiction and documentary, I mean, it's so different from when it was probably made.
Hi. So we talked about the political ideologies of the movie and also still life. I just wanted to say that it captured the themes of Calcutta, the city itself, also really well. Like if we see today, even after so many years, you could say that still life is somewhat of a metaphor for the city itself. It tries to resist modernity. It's somewhat struggling between its colonial past, but also, and regardless of what the political theme is in West Bengal or the nation, protests are a theme. So I just felt like the protagonist itself and the story itself was sort of also a metaphor or a description of the city itself. So yeah, that's it.
I have a little thing about this. Also about how films make in this particular thing about the film in Calcutta. Okay, this is an episode, and it's a bit of it's actually not very serious, but still it is serious. What happens is that when Mrinal Sen is making Akare Sandhane, he's making Akare Sandhane, and as you know, he shoots his film in this Haveli in North Bengal somewhere, So he is shooting this film, and he has his actors coming along, and all those alienations, Smita Patil, if you've seen Akare Sandhane. So here's something that happens. The owner of that Haveli wants to meet Mrinal Sen, and he asks to meet him, and he says, what happened? And he says, my grandfather, the owner of the Haveli's grandfather, used to be once upon a time a film producer. And he says, really? I say, yeah, I mean, there's a film connection with my family. He says, really? And he says, yeah, not only that, but there are actually some reels lying in the ancient room of this Haveli, which have been lying there for 50 years. And he says, what reels? And they actually open an old rotten dabba, and inside that old rotten dabba, there are actually 35mm celluloid reels of some film once upon a time that was made. So Mrinal Sen says, what do I do? So he actually calls P.K. Nair, who's the director of National Archive of India, and he says, I think that there is something that could be very precious. You send a guy and collect this and take it and do what you can with it. In the process, what happens is that the first ever Bengali silent film to have survived, Jamai Babu, is found. Yeah? Now, Jamai Babu is a lowbrow, nothing comedy about a country bumpkin who comes to Calcutta. But it has footage of Calcutta in 1931 that you wouldn't have otherwise. The film is not intended as a documentary. It is intended as a lowbrow comedy, and this guy basically bumbling around in Chauringi, is what there is in that footage. Now, Mrinal Sen, he said, I'm very happy that that film has been found, but the fact of the matter is that I'm not interested in silent cinema. I'm not interested in Jamai Babu. You can do what you want with it. For me, there is no cinema in India before Pather Panchali, really. And I don't care about the silent film. So, but there's something really, really kind of bizarre about a film that he is trying to make being kind of unintentionally produced by another film that he accidentally chances upon, which actually produces Calcutta in a way that he also wants to produce. Something like that. It's one of those accidents of history. Sorry, Nisha, you had a question.
So I'm just saying that this film is made in 71. They've all seen Godard, probably read New Wave novel, and Godard talked about how anything with the distance of time becomes documentary. And many such ideas he's addressing and finding a gap wherever he can in the story to comment on the making, comment on the fact that, for example, the actress from Pather Panchali, she herself is she carries the story of Pather. So she's not just there as an actor. She brings a whole history. So constantly he's finding these gaps to sort of thicken, instead of just going with the narrative plot of, the interview. Yeah. So the idea is that it sounds frustrating today, but he's really thickening everything and giving so much information about the city wherever he can find, whether it be about, even like his comments on still art and, whatever that is happening. But he just wants to say a lot about everything. And he does that within this, finding gaps here, which already has been demonstrated by French filmmakers before this, etc. And he's just sort of taking it to another level. So and I don't think the idea is to frustrate or hold on to the fact that he has a story, but how much he can tell about this city in that one day. So we've already had Chloe, 9 to 5, so we've already had those one-day films, where they've demonstrated this. Yeah. A city in a personal story, etc. So, the political in the personal. So, I got much of that from this film. Yeah.
Totally agree. No, there's this famous line that says that a film starring Mae West is a documentary on Mae West. That all films are at their base documentaries to the extent that all films capture something, and that something may well be a record of something else. And of course, fiction filmmakers aren't necessarily aware of the fact that there is a certain way they're capturing something which might be true, taken to, like it happened to Jamai Babu. Sen, on the other hand, does seem to have some documentary impulse going on at the back, that when he's taking a shot, even if it's a shot of fiction, there is some recognition, although he wasn't a great documentary filmmaker. He's not really made documentaries of any consequences, I remember. But there is a certain documentary impulse that he seems to be having there. One, again, a jokey comment, not so jokey, Iqbal Masood's famous line saying that the Indian New Wave was born in the corridors of the Alliance Française. That was where they found it.
Okay. Well, on that note, I guess, thank you so much, Ashish, Srikanth. And thank you all for spending your Saturday evening with us and staying until the very end. I hope you come for the next screening next month once we announce it. And also, if you're interested in other things happening at the museum, please feel free to follow us on social media or subscribe to our newsletter. Have a good weekend.